Well, I'm here this morning on the border between Lebanon and Syria, and this is the border on the main road to Damascus from Beirut. In fact, Damascus is 25 miles, 40 kilometers further up this road. And there's a certain amount of chaos, as always is at a border crossing, but actually remarkably little. Now, it would be perfectly possible to do a piece like other media organisations showing us chaos and saying thousands of people are returning back to Syria, but it's completely untrue. It's an absolutely false narrative. In fact, this queue of cars waiting to get into Syria is about 20 cars long. It took us literally 50 minutes to drive through the queue. On the way here, on the road was very largely empty. And I've not seen more than 6 vehicles that look like families returning with their household goods and things. That really is a false narrative. It isn't happening. If you could take a shot showing now, and we could make it look like some magic of television. We could make it look like there are thousands and thousands of people going back into Syria, but actually they're not. There are tens of people going back into Syria. The border crossing is interesting because it's actually unmanned on the Syrian side. The Syrian border guards, like most of the Syrian authorities, have disappeared. The hills across here are Syria, and behind them, Israel is advancing towards Damascus. On the way here, we drove past Mount Hermon, and the Israelis occupied Mount Hermon 3 days ago. And behind these mountains, the Israelis are advancing fast towards Damascus. In fact, this morning it was reported by Reuters they are only 20 kilometers out of Damascus, and it appears that Israel has occupied something like 3 times the Gaza Strip in Syria inside the last 3 days. And tellingly, Israel has met not one piece of opposition, but HTS, which has taken over Syria apparently, has done nothing whatsoever to try to impede, stop or slow down the Israeli advance, and they have not fired a single shot at an Israeli soldier occupying Syrian land. And that's it, that's the end of the queue. It's about 24 cars long and almost entirely consists of single men driving cars, going about whatever business they're going about. But the media narrative of families massively returning into Syria is just completely and utterly false, just absolutely untrue, not happening whatsoever. I'm here now in the town of Belies in Lebanon, on the Syrian-Lebanese border. The hills behind me are in Syria. And unsurprisingly, this is where a very large number of Syrian refugees settled, just over the border, close to their homes. In fact, in this district, there are 200,000 Syrian refugees living, many of whom have been here for 10 years or more. And as with all refugee camps throughout the Middle East, a number of quite good buildings and shops have sped up, and people have managed to find ways to make a living and integrate into the economy. But also a great many people still live in tented camps, like the tented camps behind me, which are run and looked after by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. But the interesting thing is everyone is still here. I've been going around, and there just is no sign of evacuation. Nobody is leaving. Obviously Syria is in a state of flux, and nobody quite knows what's going to happen. Nobody quite knows what the new government's going to look like, and no one really knows what that government is going to govern, because there's a genuine question as to whether Syria actually really exists anymore. The Israelis are taking more and more of the country. A quarter of the country or more to the east has been occupied long term for the Americans, who, you'll not be surprised to hear, are occupying most of the region's oil fields and stealing the oil. Their excuse for doing that was to protect the Syrian Kurds, but it's actually only the north 10% of the area occupied by the Americans which has any substantial Kurdish population in it. Most of it is pretty well uninhabited desert, but it happens to have oil. So that's what's occupied by the American armed forces. Today, the Turks, the Turkish military, are in Aleppo, in Syria's biggest city. Israel, the United States, Turkey are dividing up Syria between them. And what exactly will be controlled by whatever new government arises in Damascus, and depending who's in the government, whether it will be able, for example, to impose its will on the mountainous coastal strongholds of the Alawite communities, remains to be seen. Syria is disintegrating, is being disintegrated. And the people who were behind the coup, that's the Turks, the Americans and the Israelis, are the chief people seeking to benefit from that disintegration.